Hello and welcome back to a special episode of I Completed 80s Music. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to meet the superb music journalist and pop culture historian Justin Lewis to discuss his new book, Into the Groove, the 1980s, the ultimate decade in music history. Justin's knowledge was off the charts, from working in music shops, writing for big compilation pieces, and now on his second book. I've been fortunate enough to get an advance copy, and all I can say is, if you have someone in your life, including yourself, who loves 80s music, then this book is the ultimate birthday or Christmas present. The book itself is a day-by-day account of 80s music, and the beauty of it is it doesn't skirt over the smaller but still really relevant events. Justin was amazing to talk to, and we discussed his dedication of the book to two pioneering broadcasters, Janice and Annie Nightingale, his own 80s journey, and other characters he was keen to bring to life, amongst other subjects. I think you're going to love it. Anyway, here it is. This is Justin Lewis. So, Justin, welcome to I Completed 80s Music. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks for inviting me.
Excellent, jolly good. So, would it be fair to say that you and I suffer from a similar affliction? That is, we both like to take pop culture and compartmentalise it into nice little tasty chunks for people.
I guess. I mean, I'm not quite sure where that comes from. Because sometimes I can let it wash over me sometimes, because it's a bit like if I hear something new now, I try not to immediately Google something that's unfamiliar, because it can feel a bit like trying to film a gig on your phone. You're one removed from it. You risk losing that first-hand experience of just enjoying the thing for what it is. But I do think, for me, from about, I suppose I would have been 10, beginning of the 80s, when I became interested in when things happened and even why things happened and how things happened, and pop music just seemed a very exciting area to explore, because it was a relatively new phenomenon at that time. I mean, it's still, it's 25. I mean, it's in 70-something now, but it felt like an art form that was still very young, really. I mean, it'd be a bit like getting into the history of cinema in the 30s or something. That actually wasn't that much. I mean, obviously there was popular music before that, but rock and roll was, as I say, 25. So I guess what's changed for me since then is I used to really care. The charts were like stone tablets of truth. It was like the charts meant everything.
Yeah.
And then I started to work in a record shop, and I realised what the sort of extent to which some of that was editorialized, and some of it was, yes, all right, some of it was people buying records, but some of it was also the marketing. So once you've worked in a record shop for a week, you kind of go, right, okay, yeah. I see how this works now, because we were on the chart panel and the record shop worked out. But no, I think I used to really care what number things got to in the charts. I don't really think about that too much now. And that's not just regarding the charts now.
Yes, of course.
But the charts then. I mean, what matters to me is, yes, was it in the charts? But also, what else was in the charts at the same time? What else was out? What had influenced it? What would it influence? And I guess like any art form, music keeps on unfolding, and it leads to the next thing. And even when it doesn't seem to, when the next thing that comes up seems completely at odds, that also feels logical. So yeah. Yes, I would say I have a slight disrespect for the charts now, but I also think that these things meant something at the time. And I guess, I mean, if I'd been into sport, I could have been obsessed with, I don't know, league tables or something.
Yes.
So it could have gone any direction really at that age.
And that naturally, I have to ask that if you were working in a record store and were a big music fan yourself, how much of your weekly wage went on new vinyl?
Well, I worked for a few different chains over the years. I stopped doing this when I was about 26, but from 18 to about 26.
Yeah.
But actually not quite as much as you might think. I mean, I because also sometimes just from hearing records a lot at work, I didn't necessarily buy them, because quite often, I particularly found this later on when I started to do, because initially it was just 2 days a week or something, or 3 days a week. By the time I was doing it as a full-time job, quite often you get home, the last thing you want to do is put music on, because you just heard it all day.
Yeah.
So, or you'd put some completely different music on that didn't have anything to do with what you've been listening to that day. So it depends. I mean, yeah, there were some shops where you'd get like a 30% discount or something, and that was huge then. But I mean, equally, I worked in a shop in my late teens that this was the shop I was talking about that was on the chart panel, and that was a huge amount of what we sold was heavy rock and metal, and that wasn't really my thing. But I really appreciated it, because I got to find out about a whole world I didn't really know much about, and that was proved very useful over the years to know about an area that you might not necessarily automatically listen to. Was very helpful. So yeah, I would say that yes, it depended, but yeah, sometimes I would get a good discount. Didn't really bother me in the end though. It was sort of like, yeah, because I would just go. I bought the records anyway. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's certain, if you want the record, you buy it. But yes.
I think music as a passion is. I mean, I guess people do find it later on in life, but I do also think, often something occurs when you're young which just absolutely buys you into it. And for me it was Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic by The Police. I'd have been 3 years old, and my sister got a compilation album. I think it was called Top of the Pops, but it wasn't the official recordings. It was,
oh yeah, I know the thing you're talking about.
Yeah, sort of a cover album with a pretty lady on the front looking like a Coke bottle, that sort of thing. Yeah. But I just remember being absolutely captivated by the musicality of the track. And I also think Prince Charming by Adam and the Ants was on there as well. And of course, when you're a kid as well, anything to do with magic or highwaymen is obviously going to capture the imagination.
Yes, yes.
But it made me laugh the other week. I do a fortnightly group chat that me and my friends do. And we've done it ever since COVID, just to kind of get us together and talk. We all live in different parts of the country. And I just attended Rewind South. And I'd posted about Roachford had been there. Andrew Roachford had been there. And he'd done his set and did a brilliant rendition of Cuddly Toy. And I'd posted about it on Instagram. And then he followed me, which was a real highlight of my week. And I said to them, "You'll never guess what, Roachford's followed me." And they all turned around and went, "Who's Roachford?" I've never been more disappointed in my friend group ever, I think. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, if you do encounter music young, I think it perhaps means more to you. I mean, what was the first song or album that really captivated you, do you think?
What was the first song? Well, funny you mentioned Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, because I bought that single at the time. I was 11.
Yeah.
And oddly, I bought a record I'll probably come back to later, but I bought Laurie Anderson's "Oh Superman" on the same day from Woolworths in town. So, and I guess the Police, though, would have been the first group that I would have described as, do you have a favourite group? But actually, one thing I've tended not to do, despite buying a lot of records over the years and being into various things, I don't really do completism very much. I don't. It's rare for me to have just about everything an artist has done, because I like having a mixture of things. Before I started buying records, though, I would say Stevie Wonder was as an important a figure as anyone, because my dad had a few of his albums, and those really did get into my head as what music could do. But then, actually, my dad's collection, by the standards of the day, was broad but not massive. So it was, we probably had I would say about 100 LPs, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not forget, LPs were very expensive in those days, and it was like, it really was an investment to go and buy an LP. But then so we had I mean, he had some classical as well, so we had some Bach and Handel and Beethoven. But we had some Beatles albums, big band stuff, because
Yeah.
he was a drummer. Sometimes Neil Diamond, Wings, Isaac Hayes, lots of things like that. So we there was quite a range.
So your career spans a number of compendiums and your own reflections on pop music. Was there a defining moment when you realised writing about pop music would be your direction of travel?
Well, I think it's something I knew I wanted to do, but I think the trouble is back then it was much more difficult to work out how you went about that. I spent a lot of my time in my teens wondering if I could write for the music press, because I read that voraciously. And I suppose I slightly regret in hindsight that I didn't just write in and pretend I was older, because later I discovered that there were people like, I mean, a good example of this is Peter Robinson, who went on to found Pop Justice. And he wrote his own fanzine publication about the KLF, which I remember ordering and sending off for that. And he turned out he was about 15 when he wrote that. And I guess I didn't have the obvious contacts who might have known how to get into the media. I didn't really know anyone like that. When I was 16, I started doing hospital radio, which that's what you did if you want to get into broadcasting in those days.
Yeah.
And tried things out on that, did some bits and pieces for that. And then after about a year and a half doing that, I heard a sort of youth current affairs type program on the local commercial station, which was called Swansea Sound, which is where I grew up, where I live now again. And a few things at once made me think it was worth trying. I mean, firstly, one of my best friends through hospital radio, who's still one of my best friends now, she was working on that show. Secondly, the show was 3 hours long. A lot of it was live. So I sensed that it might need some contributors. So I sent a couple of spec reviews in. I think my friend probably put a word in for me as well. So I got in. And so every week, and I was 17, 18 at this point. So I was still at school. I was still in the sixth form. I wrote and presented a piece for the radio every week, which was a 5-minute piece, somewhere between opinionated and factual and sometimes humorous, or at least I'd like to think so. And a lot of the time it was about music or TV or stuff like that, things I was interested in. But the discipline of doing that on a weekly basis was really important, really useful. I don't imagine many people were listening. I don't have a lot of evidence that we had a lot of listeners, but it was certainly very good practice. And I found that really exhilarating to have such a platform. It was a real privilege. I did not take it for granted, because I just thought, in those days, the only way you could do that, this was the end of the 80s. So there was no internet, but the only other thing you could have done really was fanzines, I suppose, or something like that. And it's surprising I didn't do something like that, actually, looking back. But anyway, but doing that, and I stopped doing that when I moved to university, and I haven't done a lot of radio since then, actually. But although that then didn't lead to other things immediately, that was a good starting point, because I felt after that I thought, well, at least I'm a reliable supplier of work. So if that happens in the future, I'll know that I can do that. And that's, from time to time, that's happened since. So that was useful, yes.
Okay. And do you think? Useful. I mean, I guess you probably would have found this out when you were at university, or not. Do you think that with it being the 80s, there was still a bit of a barrier in terms of entries into broadcasting? Were they still taking from the top universities and things like that, or was it relatively open at that point?
Well, by the time I was 19, which is when I went away to university, so I graduated when I was about 22. I think what changed, the BBC was still quite Oxbridgey, I think it's fair to say. And I think, to be honest, the BBC has always been a bit Oxbridge like that. But I think Channel 4 changed it a lot. I think Channel 4 started when I was 12. And I think what I saw with Channel 4, and in fact, maybe that's what gave me the idea that maybe it would be worth trying to get into broadcasting, because it did give new people a sort of a way in.
Yeah, a platform.
So one of the things that they tried to do was they wanted to get people who hadn't previously worked in television, or they were, quite a lot of the people who were on the board at Channel 4 were people who hadn't really worked in telly before. Some of them worked in academia, some had worked for newspapers, some of them had worked in radio. But they got in people who were often very young. Some of them, it could be argued, weren't ready for a TV career, actually. I mean, Channel 4 was very variable in the early years, but actually huge amounts of what we take for granted on television now got started, whether that was alternative cabaret or there was sort of investigative journalism that kind of came from somewhere else. I mean, it had all been very white and male before that. And
Yes.
I think Channel 4 did give women, people of colour, you know, lots of people had a bit more of an opportunity to get into that world. And I've never actually worked in television, so it's something I'm really, really interested in, but I've never actually done very much of it. But as I understand it, I think there was a period where, in as much as there is even a TV industry now, because I think there's just so little money now, and I think unless it's funded by Netflix, and even that is very capricious. I think partly because we're just. I think the trouble is Britain wanted this sort of multi-channel world like America has, but it doesn't really have America's money. So consequently, it's very hard. I think this is why formats keep going and going and going now for years on end, because they know it's a tried and tested format. It's a very big risk now to start something and not know whether it's going to find an audience, or I mean, I don't envy people working in that world at the moment, because it does sound very precarious. But yeah, I mean, I can't remember what the original question was now, but I certainly, when I did think that television looked like it was going to be very interesting, and I think programs like, there was a program on, which you may remember, certainly if people who are interested in the 80s may remember it, a program called Network 7, which was a Channel 4 program on Sundays. Janice Portal was one of the producers. And one of the ideas with that was the idea that you were doing a Sunday supplement on television, effectively. So it was this 2-hour program, lots of reporters who were basically producing their own material for it. And that was a very, I mean, Network 7 was a mixture of, sometimes it was brilliant, sometimes it was disastrous. But I did like the idea that was something that had never really been on television before. It was very fast. There was lots of captions. There were lots of ideas. And I just remember finding that a really exciting program. To actually watch one now, I'm not sure what it would be like. But I think at the time that things like that made you think, oh, okay, yeah, that might be an option. So there were things like that. And those are important.
I guess if you're young nowadays, it's me sounding really young. If you're young, you've got the democratization of media through, I guess, TikTok and YouTube and that world where anybody can potentially be a broadcaster of some form.
Yes, although I think the problem, funnily enough, is the problem I had when I was trying to find a way in was that there were hardly any ways in. Yeah. The trouble now is exactly the opposite. There are loads of ways in, but how do you get noticed? And how do you get to the next stage? So I think that's the only problem now, is that because everyone has that option, and obviously that's brilliant, and it gives you the chance to sort of try things out, and it doesn't feel like a big deal if one thing doesn't work out.
Absolutely.
The next thing will. But it's still a bit of a lottery. So yeah, I mean, good luck to anyone starting out now. I think it's not easy at all.
No, absolutely. So returning to your initial outputs, you worked on Time Out's 1000 Songs to Change Your Life. It's a very evocative title, as it were. And I'm guessing that there were omissions or inclusions which would both please and offend people. How did the writers' room choose which songs made the cut there? And did that create a lot of heated arguments with the other writers? Or?
Well, I think it's important to say here, it's funny you've mentioned this, because I hadn't thought about this book for quite a long time, so I just got it off the shelf the other day. But it's the book format wasn't quite what you might imagine from that. So, because for a start, the thing about 1000 Songs makes it sound like, oh, we did a poll, or we voted. It wasn't that sort of book. What happened was a friend of mine, an old friend of mine from college, became like was music editor at Time Out for a while, and he asked me. This was in 2007, I want to say. He asked me if I would like to contribute a chapter for it, and the way it worked was not that there was here's 1,000 songs that we all loved. It was about finding a subject and writing an essay about that and bringing out examples of that. And so there was some quite interesting writers on that project. Some people were music writers, but there was also a tenor, a singer called Ian Bostrich, very acclaimed tenor, who wrote a really good essay for that. Bob Stanley from Saint Etienne wrote a really good essay for it. I was in very good company in that book. And I wrote this essay about fame and about how people write about that. And so there were, I think I included things like I Want to Be Adored by the Stone Roses, but also else. I should have it next to me, really. Pulp's This Is Hardcore, which is a song really about celebrity. There were lots of things like that, really, where so really it was a strange book in the sense that it wasn't really a list book, which you'd think from that title it might be.
Yeah.
The other thing to say, it didn't really have a writer's room. We were all submitting our essays independently. So I didn't really meet some of the other authors till we had the launch, which was in a pub in Clerkenwell. But it was great. The last time I read the essay, it looked really good. So I'm very proud of that project. That was great. Yeah.
I mean, that essay you touched upon. We're obviously talking more about the 80s, but you mentioned there, I Want to Be Adored, and then you mentioned This Is Hardcore. Do you think that was reflective of the journey that music and especially Britpop took over that period, where you had this sort of burgeoning scene that had come from Manchester, and you end up with Blur and Oasis and Echo Belly and Elastica and Pulp and everyone else? And that for me was the absolute sweet spot of my teenage years. I was 16 in 1994. And it was heaven. It was very heaven, as it were. But I can remember by about 1998, even I felt the scene had become very decadent and bloated. Within your own essay, the piece about This Is Hardcore, do you think that was a reflection of how I suppose we'd had this Cool Britannia moment where it kind of felt like what was cool had been co-opted by the new Labour government and various other sources?
It could be that. I think, though, that certainly with that particular song, I get the impression from what Jarvis Cocker has said about it since, that because Pulp becoming massive was certainly not something you'd have predicted.
No.
Even a year or 2 years before it happened. So, they've been going a long time. I'm not saying anything terribly surprising here, I know, but they've been going for a long time. They were effectively a sort of cult act for most of the 80s. Nobody imagined they were going to be jostling for number one in the charts. But the other thing to say about it is that I think Jarvis Cocker gave me the impression that he had more or less sussed out what celebrity was going to be like. Because people generally, it's even less so now, people tend not to become famous in their 30s now. The idea you become a famous pop musician in your 30s, that's quite late. It was quite late then. But actually, I think the impression I get with Jarvis Cocker is that I think he really, I remember thinking, oh, he's sensible, he's savvy. He kind of, and by his own admission, he kind of lost the plot for a bit. As to be honest, I probably would.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would. It's a bit of an odd thing being really famous, I imagine. I think it's because it isn't what you think. I'm sure it's not what you think it's going to be. I think you start to sort of have the control of your life tends to slightly fall away from you. And some people are very happy with that. Some people are not. And I think you could sort of see why some people go off the rails a bit. I can totally understand that.
Yeah.
Because it's not a natural... Being famous is not really a natural state, I would say. So I think, yes, I suppose it did mean that there was this pop. I think also the other one, Britpop, take that as an, I mean, I should say my essay wasn't just about Britpop records. But what I think what those examples tell you is that Britpop was not really. I'm not sure Britpop was really meant to be a movement that was going to last very long anyway. I think because firstly, it's a scene based on bands, and obviously you've got bands. Bands have a tendency to fall out with each other. Generally, it's not like a solo artist where you can sort of go on and on and on, really,
Sure.
and work with different people. But bands, there's always that risk, particularly if you're touring around for half the year, and it's like we like going on tour with people you work with. How long could you do that for, really? It's that sort of thing. I mean, I mean, even though you might well get on very well with your colleagues on a sort of 9 to 5 basis, but if you have to spend nearly all the time with them and you're away from your family and all that kind of thing, I'm sure that would affect people. So I think how much of it would have been. Also, there's that real sort of pressure of, if you've had 10 years or 5 years to prepare stuff for your first album, and then that's a hit, but then you've got to deliver your second album a year later, and it's got to be at least as good, if not better. That's a hell of a lot of pressure for people, and and it's not. And you probably haven't started earning proper money yet.
Of course.
That tends to take its time. You've got There's always that thing as well of being, we've got a £1 million contract with whoever. That doesn't mean you're getting paid £1 million.
Yes.
Which is what some people still think happens when people get. It's not like that. So I think I'm rambling, but I think that's what all of that came out in that Pulp song. I think it's. I get the impression they're all much happier now. So they'll seem much more level-headed about it.
It's on their terms. I was watching and again, a bit of a digression, but I was watching the boy bands documentary that the BBC put out recently.
Oh, yeah.
And in some ways it was, it wasn't horrific, because I think we all knew it was going on, but the exploitation of the lads in Take That or Five or whoever it was. But it is so refreshing now to see them doing the retro circuits, but it's completely on their own terms now. And it makes them so much more relaxed, because there isn't the, put out an album, do this single, do that video, go and tour this, and the relentlessness of it, where, like you say, there might be a multi-million-pound deal, but the person scooping up a lot of that is probably going to be the management team around them. Well, they might get some sort of paltry stipend in return, but
yes, yeah. I think also that presumably when people are doing the reunion tours now, the people going are also going to be more level-headed about it as well.
Yeah.
Because when you're young, and I know this being a fan when I was young, is that it's the most important thing in the world, and it's not quite. I mean, I still think music's immensely important, but it's not like the obsession is different, because when you're a teenager, you don't have any other responsibilities in life, really. I think that sort of means that there's a sort of a safety in being excited about these things. So I think that's a factor as well.
I remember in my teens, I would religiously read The Enemy cover to cover.
Yes,
and it just meant everything. Every week, that was my world, as it were. But
yes, absolutely.
You've also written for books like the Guinness Book of British Hit Singles and the Rough Guide to Rock.
Yes.
When you've got compendiums like that, how does it work as a writer?
Well, firstly, my duties on those books were very different. Rough Guide to Rock came first, and that began with me. I think I answered an ad in The Guardian, I want to say, and that was in about 95. And so the first thing I did was I sent in a couple of spec biographies, because the idea for that book was that it was a collection of biographies of bands, but written by sort of fans. I think they were trying to get away from having established pop journalists writing things. They wanted some new names. So I sent in a couple of those, and they liked those enough that they gave me some more. And then after doing those, I thought I'd chance my arm and ask if they needed any help with the editing process. And I mean, my main job now is a copy editor in books. So that was my first sort of big role in doing something like that.
Yeah.
And some of that job was trying to establish a house style without diluting the efforts of the various contributors. I mean, one of my favourite things about that book was it had enough of a variety that we could have a deadpan biography of Spinal Tap, but it had all the fake history intact, so that it read like I mean, they are a real band in the sense that they've made albums.
Yes,
but it made no mention of Michael McKean and Christopher Guest and Harry Shearer. It just mentioned Nigel Tufnell and Davis and Hubbins, and so it made it sound like you're just reading about a band, same as you're reading about any other band. So it just seemed really funny to have that in the mix with Guinness Hit Singles and albums. And I worked on that quite some time after the period when it was Gambaccini and Mike Reed and the Rice Brothers, which was later. I worked on a few volumes of that, and that was a different affair in that. So I wasn't, for example, involved in researching chart data or anything like that, but my role was really writing these tiny biographies for acts. So if you saw the editions, this would have been the editions that were coming out at the turn of the 20th, 21st century. And so it would be, here's an artist or band, and you have to sum it up in 40 words or something. Which is a skill in itself.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you've got to try and think, okay, in what way can I make this a unique 40 words, but which conveys the act? And that was quite a challenge, actually. I mean, I can't remember the sort of thing I wrote again now. It's a long time ago, but I seem to remember that was quite a challenge. It was quite a good writing exercise, actually.
Yeah, and within that was that something that really turned you on to assembling and verifying musical history?
I mean, in an amateurish way, I'd already been doing that anyway. But I think, I mean, by then, I mean, I worked at PRS for a while, and I'd worked in record shops, and so I was used to that idea that it was about accumulating knowledge. Sometimes for practical reasons, not necessarily for its own sake. I mean, my friends would insist that I was useful in a pub quiz, but I think also it was about being able to, just kind of being able to amass information like that. I mean, we're still talking at that period before there was really the internet. I mean, this is the late. I mean, actually, the Rough Guide to Rock, funnily enough, was one of the very first books I think that was also circulated online. I think at least this is one of the first. I remember being, when I was doing the material for that, we were told, yes, there's going to be, there might even have been a CD-ROM version of it. I might on that, I can't remember, but it was quite early on, and so this was a very exciting period, because I remember being asked to do that. And I thought, I don't even have the internet. I have no real concept of what it was, except it was something to do with computers. And so that was my first experience of working on something that was going to be online. So that was an exciting period.
And do you I mean, in some ways you were kind of cutting your teeth there with it, and you mentioned that you were doing it previously in a more amateur capacity. Do you think that refining that approach then helped you in the development of your future work and your own style, especially with your previous book, Don't Stop the Music?
Yeah, and there's quite a big gap between those two things, and in the meantime I was doing all sorts of stuff, really. But I mean, the thing with Don't Stop the Music was that it wasn't going to be a doorstop of a book. It was not a long book, but it required an eclectic approach, because you'd need material for every day of the calendar year. So you can't really do, what you can't do there is go, October 19th, can't find anything here. So you can't really, that wouldn't fly, I think. That wouldn't fly. So you had to, once you'd committed to that, you had to, although October the 19th, funnily enough, was a difficult year to find things for. That is not random. that was quite hard to find for that day for some reason. I have no idea why this should be the case. But also, it wasn't just about finding things. It was about, there was a certain amount of, okay, say you've got, I don't know, a Beatles story on October the 18th, unless it relates to what you put on October the 18th, you probably shouldn't have a Beatles story on October the 19th. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, it's about making the thing as wide as you can in terms of just getting as many names in. So for reasons, and possibly not for reasons, for some dates a lot more happened than for others, but I had a rule which I retained for the new book, that although I had some ideas in the back of my mind that I knew I wanted to include, I also kept my mind open for anything potentially. So, anything that I found that could work. So I think really I started with a blank canvas, just filled a document as I found out various things and was reminded of various things. And so I went on and on and on like that until I thought, my deadline is approaching. I'd better start pulling this all together. So that's how that started.
Excellent. So we come to your new book, Into the Groove, the 1980s, the ultimate decade in music history, which will be coming out in October. How would you describe it to the earnest consumer?
It's a month-by-month history of pop with the 80s. So January 80 to December 89, 120 sections. And I hope that it tells the story, or a number of stories really, of how pop develops into the beginnings of how we recognize it now. So sample culture, hip-hop, house, big pop stars like Madonna and Prince and Whitney and George Michael and so on. But also the development of video and digital technology, so CDs and satellite, and these things are helping to unite the world because things like video clips compresses all of this. And obviously some of these things existed before the 80s, but the 80s I think is when all these places around the world get a little bit closer together. I don't think they use this phrase anymore, but the global village starts to form in this period. And some of that's MTV, and some of it's just selling clips around the world. So I think that would be how I'd sum it up. But as I say, there's a lot of different stories, and hopefully they all coalesce near the end.
You've used the ultimate decade in music history in the title. That's quite a big shout. It's not necessarily one that I would disagree with, though. Right. What was it that made the 80s so unique in your view?
Well, firstly, I'd better say that the subtitle was something the publishers suggested, and I totally understand why they did.
Yeah.
But I think they have a point, because subjectively, it's a formative period for me. It almost exactly fits my second decade in the world. I turned 10 in 1980, I turned 20 in 1990, so I'm almost destined to be biased about it. But it does lay the ground for the 21st century in a way that I don't think the 60s or 70s quite did. Obviously, we couldn't have had the 80s without the 60s and 70s. But I think some of the things I just described just now, the sort of digital music culture, it did create the kind of sound that we take for granted, because now the sound of pop is based on all those foundations of what we had in the 80s. So I think it's fair to say that the 80s is an immensely important period for how we consume music now.
I'd 100% agree with you. I think whether it's, I don't know, Nick Hayward or Duran Duran or Depeche Mode or whoever it is, when you listen to modern music and it, it's all still very electronic, synth driven. Obviously the production techniques are different, but the sound is the same. It almost sometimes, I think, makes the 90s feel like almost a bit of an aberration. There's obviously that element of it, whether it's your Gina G and that element of pop music, but things like Britpop almost feel like a bit of an anomaly, because the sound of the 80s, I think, is still so prevalent in pop music that you hear today.
It depends. I think the thing that's the 90s are kind of interesting too, but I think there are different approaches to it. And I think the most important element of new music in the 80s, although we didn't necessarily realize this at the time, I'm sure I did, certainly, is the development of hip hop is without question the biggest thing that happened in the 80s, I think. And that just gets bigger in the 90s. So I think that's part of it. The development of R&B, the development of I mean, also just that thing of rock and rap fusing in the 80s, that becomes a thing in the 90s more and more and more. And so I think it depends on whether you're a fan of that sort of music or not. But I think the evolution continued. And so I think that's always what's interested me, is this idea that music doesn't stop, and there's always new things coming through. And so it's what I find interesting about it even now is how all these things kind of continue to cross-pollinate, and how all these different influences sort of float around. So I think the 90s, I mean, it's impossible for me to have exactly the same relationship as I did with the 80s, for example, but I think that's also just because I was an adult in the 90s and I wasn't in the 80s for most of it. And suddenly I had a job and money concerns, yes. And you've suddenly got different priorities in your life. And so you're necessarily going to have a slightly different approach to it, because when you're a teenager, you've basically got school, but you don't have a lot of other things generally. If you're lucky, you've got a free rein to be into your passions at that age.
So, and that leads me on to an interesting question, in that I think with my podcast, so my experience of the 80s, I was 11 in 89, so I'd had my childhood in that period, and the music was very much in the background and ever colourful, but I wasn't understanding the interplay between the bands, what was happening. And so now my enjoyment of it is discovering those stories, discovering Malcolm McLaren nicking Adam Ant's band, and those kind of stories. Your lived experience is slightly different in that you're a little older, and that, like you say, you were coming towards the end of your university time by the end of the decade. So what were your reflections of that moment, and what was it that you wanted to get from this book?
Okay, well, firstly, I'd only just started at university in 89, so it was I was there in the last few months, so it was very much end of the 80s at college. Thing is, what people tend to do now, and I've done it a couple of times in this conversation, really, people talk about the 80s as if it was this one thing.
Yeah.
But obviously it wasn't, because it was never just one thing at all. And I mean, I don't remember anyone saying in the 80s, hooray, we're living in the 80s, or even we're living in 1987, or whatever the year would have been. Because it depended on who you were, how old you were, where you lived, what sort of disposable income did you have, what media did you have access to, and that varied wildly just in the UK, let alone territories abroad. There were all sorts of versions of the 80s. For myself, at the beginning of the 80s, I can remember wanting to make sense of pop in my own head. By the end of the decade, I still had that excitement. I still have it now to some extent. But it was so weird even then to look back and think how much things changed just within that decade. It's really quite striking. Obviously, I'd changed too in all sorts of ways, physically, emotionally, all sorts of ways. But what I wanted to get out of the book was to lay bare all these different versions of the 80s, try and put them against each other and see where the connections happen. I mean, a good one there, and I cited it just a moment ago, but the way in which rap and rock start to work together, for instance. So people like Run DMC, Beastie Boys, Def Jam records. And that's one reason that MTV in America, which had not had a good record with rap music, started to champion that hybrid, because MTV was about rock music. So when rap starts to do rockier records, that was the new version of rock. So that's how it started to make this connection. I find all of that kind of thing really fascinating, and that those sorts of connections were the things that were very exciting to find when I was doing the research. And I mean, some of these things I sort of knew, but to have the sort of to actually be able to find, that's when that happens. That's very interesting, have that kind of approach to it. So yes, that was the aim, really, with the book.
Have you, just as a complete aside, have you read the Beastie Boys book?
Do you know, I haven't. I must do. It's been out a while, hasn't it?
It has.
I need to. There's been so many books I've been meaning to get hold of, and that's one of them. So I must check that out. It's good, is it?
Oh, it is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, it was obviously written post Adam Yauch's passing.
Yes.
It's quite emotional from that perspective, but just understanding their journey from the hardcore roots of loving Bad Brains, and then going to Danceteria and hearing Tom Tom Club's music and Grace Jones, and then, like you say, finding rap as a and hip hop as a burgeoning scene, but where you need, Russell, is it Russell Simmons who's the mogul? Him
and Rick Rubin.
Yeah. And Rick Rubin, of course, and then them starting to do things like Pollywog Stew and meeting Rick Rubin, and then their journey, and then picking their instruments back up. It's such a, and just the pictures as well, they're just so evocative. It's one of the best musical autobiographies I've ever read. It is so good.
I mean, I love that story about them supporting Madonna before anyone really knew who they were, the first tour, and being booed off every night. And Madonna just going, well, I don't care because they're brilliant, But I mean, interestingly, and I couldn't verify this carefully enough to get it in the book, but I believe that the act that she wanted to open for her on tour would have been Bronski Beat, but Jimmy Somerville left.
Right.
At around the same time, and to form Communards, which would totally make sense, but I couldn't. The only source I had for that was someone in Bronski Beat saying it, and I thought, well, if I'd had Madonna saying it, then I might have.
Then you could probably get away with it. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it might well be the case. I don't know, but that was one of those moments where you think, I'd love to put this in, but I'm not sure. So it might be that they weren't considered. But yeah, the Beastie Boys opening for Madonna is quite a thing. I love that story. Anyway. I
noticed the dedications to two particular titans of broadcasting and champions of all music genres, the peerless Annie Nightingale and Janice Long. What did they mean to you growing up?
People often talk about the importance of John Peel and the Peel Sessions, and I totally get all that, except that for most of the 80s I wasn't really listening to his show, from maybe 88, because they moved his show a bit earlier in the evening. But prior to then, I was usually either watching TV in the late evening or I was just in bed. And the sort of stuff he was playing, didn't seem like the sort of thing that I would like, even though I look back at the running orders now and think, well, actually I would have gone for quite a lot of that. But Janice Long and Annie Nightingale were probably the two people on the radio, certainly on Radio 1, who I listened to most regularly, because I didn't grow up somewhere where there was lots of pirate radio, for instance. I wasn't in London. I wasn't in Manchester. I was somewhere where there was basically an independent station and Radio 1, and there wasn't much else. And so Janice and Annie had that charisma and ability to make that sort of connection between the broadcast and the listener feel very special. I mean, on the face of it, you could just say, well, Janice just played new bands and Annie did a request show after the top 40. But neither of those descriptions really gets to the heart of what they did. So, yes, Janice Long played new bands, but she also was a very good interviewer, I thought, covered a lot of very serious current affairs issues, had lots of studio guests. You could tell that she was selecting a lot of the music herself with the producer and doing all of that. So, I mean, that was a really good evening show. And I think she was treated very shabbily by Radio 1 when she was pregnant, and they effectively scrapped her show when she went on maternity leave. They invited her to do a half-hour highlight show instead, which anyone could have done, really. It's one of Radio 1's lowest moments, I would say. But
of a number.
I mean, luckily. Sorry? Of a number.
Of a number.
Yeah. I'd say from that period, it's one of the worst things. But I mean, also, luckily, Janice versatile enough to have a long career after that, and I have very fond memories of hearing a late night show on Radio 2 for a number of years. But and Annie's show, a request show, but that program introduced me to so much left field stuff. I mean, that show could so easily have just been 2 hours a week of U2, Simple Minds, and Duran Duran. You wouldn't have needed to do much work on it, really. But Annie and her various producers, most regularly a man called Pete Ritzema, did a lot of work, I think, in trying to make that program as eclectic and as special as possible. I mean, she would play lots of things that I'd never heard before. Lots of out there rock. She played dub reggae, 12-inch mixes, long forgotten oldies in a time when you couldn't access old music very often. Really unusual things, sometimes just downright stupid things. Some of it really, what the hell was that? And not just music. I mean, I think I first heard Beyond the Fringe sketches on that show, and it's comedy things. She'd play things like that, or poetry, or things like that. And that's before we even reach that next era where she was playing more and more dance music, which of course became what she would do later, the middle of the night shows. I mean, they were both such important people. They were like having elder siblings who were on the radio, and for a while when I dallied with the idea of being a broadcaster, they were massive influences on me, and I'm certain they influenced a lot of girls to go into broadcasting. There were hardly any doing that at the time. There was hardly anyone in Britain doing that kind of thing, really. Radio was so male back then. So yes. They were brilliant and they were important.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to touch upon, I suppose, the 80s as an industry in a moment. I can remember in the late 90s especially, and this might just be recency bias or the next generation looking down on the previous one with a degree of disdain, but I think there was a real feeling that the 80s were, at the time it was things like the decade that fashion forgot, and there was a lot of criticism of it, especially Britpop had been seen as this sort of British cultural moment, Jerry Halliwell in the Union Jack skirt and all of that kind of stuff. Do you think the mood has mellowed on the 80s, and why do you think that is, if that's the case?
Some of it's probably pure nostalgia.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the gatekeeping and snobbery has probably disappeared, thank God. I mean, I think some of the things written about people like Rick Astley and Kylie Minogue and even Madonna, I mean, there's this genuine hatred circulating about them, usually from very serious-faced people. And I think that was partly the result of this sort of Rolling Stone idea of pop was, which I've never really liked, that pop was for kids and idiots, and rock was for clever and grown-up people. And so for those people, the 80s would have been quite calamitous, I think. And I quite like some rock, don't tell anyone, but I do like some rock. But in truth, I love pop more because pop can be anything, it can do anything. For some people, pop really is the biggest insult you can use. But for me, the Beatles were pop, they weren't rock. Even when they were rock, they were still pop. So, I mean, I remember when I was at college, someone laughed at the fact that I had Pet Shop Boys records, but they didn't laugh at my New Order records, and I just didn't understand what the difference between the two of them was. I thought they were both equally valuable, so I couldn't see any difference. And also to know that those two groups really liked each other.
Yeah,
they liked each other's records, so that was good enough for me. Even if they hadn't, I wouldn't have cared. But it never really mattered to me what people thought of things. I couldn't understand why people would read the music press and write in to complain about the writer who'd given their favourite band a really bad review. I just thought, well, live with it. It's not like it's they just think differently to you. And I could never. I mean, I'm aware that, for example, Pet Shop Boys, who I really liked, I believe their least favourite group at the time was The Cure. I really liked The Cure, so I didn't care. I didn't like. It was fine. Can't all like the same stuff. I sound like someone's mum now, don't I? But anyway, it's.
I really like Cliff Richard. Great.
Yeah. Hey, listen, we don't talk anymore. It's a great song.
What?
Anyway,
Hey, Wired for Sound. I mean,
yeah, there you
I
go.
work quite close to Milton Keynes, and I still
Oh,
wander near the John Lewis where it was shot, and marvel that actually it hasn't really changed at
does
all.
everyone have to go through on roller skates now
No, sadly
in
not.
tribute to it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No, so yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I think yeah, time passing helps as well. I mean, I think people tend not to have these grudges anymore. I think some people miss that. I don't particularly, but then I didn't really have those grudges then. So anyway.
And I mentioned the industry that has popped up around it, and that might be the TV programs like the Goldbergs, it might be podcasts like my own, or you just need to go on Instagram and see people making synth music in the style of 80s or whatever. Do you think that is a reflection of, and I'll draw the comparison here within the 80s itself, that in the early 80s especially, you obviously had the ska revival and you had rockabilly. Yes. And it almost felt like, that period of time in Britain, there was a lot of social unrest, economic unrest, and it felt like people were hearkening back, with rockabilly, which was very much a 50s sort of sound, to simpler, happier times. And I do kind of wonder, in the post-COVID landscape, where there is uncertainty globally and various issues currently, again, whether you feel there is a hearkening back to the 80s as almost a bit of a safe place and the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia.
It might be that. I think the 80s revival, it's a good question. When does the 80s revival actually begin? And I'm never quite sure the answer of that, although I think there's often a 20-year rule with these kind of things.
Yeah.
When in the mid 80s, when I was at school, there seemed to be a big cult at school where and I wasn't one of these people particularly, but I remember there was a coterie of people there who suddenly were interested in the Velvet Underground and the Doors and the Stones, and the mid 60s seemed to be in fashion again. And so I think maybe that just happens. I mean, there was definitely a 70s revival in the 90s. There was definitely an 80s revival in the noughties. I think some of these periods of time are now getting... I mean, there was a 50s revival in the 70s. I mean, the American Graffiti and Happy Days and Grease, it was all that 20 years... Oh, it was 20 years ago. And obviously the people who were in their teens in the 50s now had, whether they had families of their own or whether they were in a position to make things as adults. So I think there's always that element going on as well, that 20 years later people look back and sometimes they've been able to step back and see the period for what it was, good or bad, But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes now, this was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, actually, was people are often reviewing this endless documentaries about the 80s, aren't there, on TV and things like that. And I think people are often reviewing the 80s without the associated difficulties. I mean, I wasn't an adult for most of it, but I often think for people who are 10 years older than me, for instance, some of whom don't remember the 80s very fondly, and I'm sure that some of that was because they had to live as adults in the 80s, and that can't have been very easy. I mean, it was like the high unemployment, or it was not an easy time for a lot of people, and there was a lot of prejudice around. A lot of that, unfortunately, seems to have come back. But I think it's sometimes there's been a fair bit of airbrushing's gone on, and I can see why. I mean, people like the idea of the past being better, and it's rarely true.
It's rarely true. Yeah,
it's rarely true. Yeah. Anyway,
in terms of the book, you could argue that the 80s is obviously very defined, but it has a start date and an end date. But within it, you've got such a broad plethora of subject matter, whether it be the burgeoning hip hop scene, or hair metal, or new wave, or the trials and tribulations of George Michael. how did you approach picking out the tasty vignettes from what is a smorgasbord of information when literally any of the topics could be a book in their own right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to repeat myself, I fear, a bit, but I mentioned earlier with the last book about how I started with a blank idea of what it could be. I did try and think, if I found something that I didn't know, I thought, which is not to say I'm holding myself up here as, oh, I know this, and if I don't know it, no one knows it. But I think sometimes you reach a level where you just sort of go, there's a chance that a lot of people might not know this, and I don't see it being repeated everywhere. Yeah. So that is a good sign. I think also a good ploy sometimes is to try and go back to as close to the event as you can, because that's normally when you get the honest response to it. So sometimes I think we've all done this, where you might remember something, but all you do after a while is you can remember yourself telling the story.
Yeah.
You don't remember how it actually happened.
Mm.
I remember, oddly enough, this brought to mind the example of Douglas Adams when he wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah. And he got asked for many years afterwards, what do you remember about how you got the idea? And he said, I was lying in a field in Innsbruck in Austria in about 1972 or something. And then he said, he was on a radio interview, and he said something like, I have to say, I have now told this story so often that I don't remember the actual original event. All I can remember is me telling the story.
Yeah.
And I knew what he meant, because I think we've all had those situations where you have a story, but of course what happens, the more you tell the story, little bits get discarded.
Yeah, the more the story is the story.
And then other things start to come in, and they're not necessarily how it happened.
Mm.
Sometimes people remember bits that they hadn't remembered before. But I think sometimes it does risk the story not quite being as true as it might have been once. So I think there's a lot to be said for trying to go back before everybody revisits, and you can rewrite history a little bit. But if you go back and find what the band thought of the song at the time, or even when they were making it, or even when they were about to make it and had a different title.
Yeah.
That to me is when you get the sort of honesty, because they don't know at that point, for example, that it's going to be a massive hit, or they don't know. Nobody knows. And so you've got that sense, the ideal is when you get a band who are in the middle of working on something and they don't know what they've got yet. That's always an interesting period to capture that. So anyway, I think that's an example of it, where you just go, I wanted to try and include things that generally don't get covered or have an angle that hasn't been sort of taken apart. So good example of that was, actually, this is an example of something that didn't make it into the book because I didn't find something that was quite right. But for example, when I was researching an event like Live Aid, one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to see who else was doing gigs that day. I was interested in who was doing it. I believe Cliff Richard was doing a gig. I believe he was asked, because I believe he was approached to do Live Aid and couldn't do it because he'd already been booked to do a gig in, I think, Birmingham.
Oh my goodness!
So, and there were a few other examples like that, and I think this is true. I think the reason why now I've forgotten whether. This is really embarrassing. I should look in my own book. Are Dire Straits on at Live Aid, or were they not? Are Dire Straits on at Live Aid?
I think they were. And I only know that
Sting, was it?
Because I've recently been looking at Romeo and Juliet, and I've got a feeling that in researching that it came up. I've got a feeling they were. Anyway.
Oh, right. I tell you who wasn't was Springsteen.
Yeah.
Springsteen wasn't at Live Aid, was he? And I believe that's because he really was on tour and was doing. I think Dire Straits were in the middle of a Wembley Arena run of gigs, so they were in London at the time and were able to do Live Aid. But anyway, I think.
Did you watch it on TV at the time, out of interest?
I did, but it sounds like I didn't from what I've just said. But it's one of those things that the funny thing with Live Aid is that I was 15 when that was on, and actually the big pull for me of Live Aid was, and this seems mad now, but there was no sense before that you could have hours and hours and hours of pop music on television. It just did not happen. There have been a couple of attempts by Whistle Test and BBC Two previous couple of years to do a thing called what they called Rock Around the Clock, where they ran essentially, I believe it was something like 16 hours of stuff, documentaries, live concerts, things like that, which had run through right into the early hours of the morning. That had not really even been done before. And of course, in America, they had MTV 24 hours a day. But in Britain, we had nothing like that. And so when Live Aid happened, the appeal was, this is going to be on for 16 hours, pretty much non-stop.
Yeah.
And this is the surprising bit, is that at the time, the story was, this will never be on again.
Yep.
Will never happen. You will never see this footage again.
Mm-hmm.
In America, they called the bluff and they wiped the tapes, apparently. In America, they I believe maybe MTV kept the footage, and the network that was broadcasting it, which I think might have been ABC, but it might not have been. I believe they wiped the tapes. I assume that because nobody signed contracts. That was the thing. Nobody had signed contracts about what would happen. So the idea that they would be on video, or the idea that it would be on DVD, or even that, and of course, that idea after the concert had gone out, the thing that I took for granted was, well, that's the end of that. So I never, even when they ran on New Year later that year, they actually ran like a selection of highlights. And I watched it with a friend and I thought, this was very special, but I didn't feel, and I've never really revisited it properly, because I just think I got used to the idea that this was a once only thing. And even the other week when they had the 40th anniversary of it, and they put like loads of it out on television, and I sort of wandered in and watched some of it, but I wasn't invested in it really. Because to me, it really did still feel like a thing that happened on the day, and that was a special moment. But I mean, obviously, we've had loads and loads of examples since, and Glastonbury's on every year now, and so we almost take it for granted.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think that kind of thing. Again, I've rambled slightly, but I think it was. I think that something like that. When I was trying to find out, I thought, well, what is a new angle to have a Live Aid? And I think the version I used in the book was that in trying to organise Live Aid, this is something I hadn't known before, was that to get the thing going, to get the thing off the ground, they actually employed someone who had worked on getting the Olympics televised in Los Angeles the year before, which makes total sense. You know, this idea that you've got a big television event that the whole world's going to watch. And so I think that those sorts of connections really interested me in terms of, you know, linking the world, because obviously this is still a period where, you know, satellite television is still relatively new.
Absolutely.
And so to have that, and I mean, really, the thing I'm astonished by Live Aid really is that very, very few things went wrong. Really, I mean, I think there's a bit in the Who where the satellite goes down for briefly, but that's about the only thing I can think of. Most of it was like nothing went wrong, really, which is astonishing.
Yeah. No, I remember being in our lounge in Kent somewhere, just sprawled on the carpet, marveling at all these incredible performers that just come out on rotation. And at the time, it just seemed very, very unique, I think. So.
Yes, there wasn't anything like it.
No. And you know, you mentioned the unique piece of research there. I can't decide whether in dealing with this subject you had an embarrassment of riches or whether it was an absolute ball ache to collate all of this, because you've obviously got the written word, you've got defunct music papers like Melody Maker, you've got the birth of the internet, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, in that there's obviously a lot of early interaction probably about the 80s at that point, because it's the late 90s, but those are hidden away in old archived GeoCity sites and things like that. And then, of course, you've got everything new since then, and Reddit forums, and on and on and on.
Mm.
How did you parse so much information, as it were?
The big advantage with having digitized sources and archive libraries, and I'd used a lot of those over the years as well, is that it is a big help with making connections, sort of connections that would have barely been noticed at the time. I mean, to be able to easily check out consecutive issues of a periodical, for instance, just makes it so much easier to track the development of something. Back in the day, I know some people did this, but not that many people would have thought to retain a year's worth of music paper, for example.
Yeah.
But I'm also a big believer in checking through things with knowing that you might not find anything relevant. You've got to do the work. You've got to just sit there going through something where you're pretty sure you're not going to find anything, or you might actually find nothing, because sometimes the really big connection will come from when you're researching something else entirely. One thing that's slightly, although I think it's generally a good series, but one of the problems when you're watching something like Who Do You Think You Are, and they have the conceit of the celebrity or the public figure who's in the library looking at whatever volume it is,
and is surprised to find, yes.
Yeah, and clearly they, researchers will have been doing that work. And I totally get why they do it for the camera like that, because obviously it wouldn't be terribly interesting television to have the researchers going through things and finding nothing for weeks on end. That's not really very...
Your granddad Gordon was an insurance underwriter. We're really sorry.
Yes. You can't, it doesn't make great television, that kind of thing. So the lesson there is it's not always about checking out the obviously relevant, but obviously you only got so much time as well. So you've got to, I had about a year to basically get the first version written, which sounds like a long time, but I honestly assure you it isn't. Got all these little fragments and you're trying to work out where they should all go. So I think it was difficult, but at the same time also what was a relief was to know that it didn't have to be definitive.
Yeah.
Or you could just, the main thing was to try and find as many things that hadn't been covered before. That was the priority, really, was to just try and make sure that there was enough in it that no one had found before or everyone had forgotten about, hopefully. So that was useful.
You've struck a balance between the large events. You mentioned things like Live Aid there, but you've also done I think a fantastic job at highlighting those little gems that people won't know.
Yeah.
Within that, how did you struggle to strike a balance between the two, or what? Was it difficult to want? It's very easy to talk about pop music, but to reference hip hop or hair metal or whatever it might be. How did you feel a responsibility to balance the genres at all, or?
Yes, really. But I think also it I did try and make sure that as many things got covered as possible. So much stuff had to be cut, really, in the end. And that's after I was allowed an extra 10,000 words in the end. But even then, I tried not to go with the stories that everyone knew, but I still made sure that I included all the names that you'd expect to be in an 80s book. So big names are in there. But what I might not necessarily have done was have the things that the well-known stuff. That said, there were some things that were too niche. There were just things that, there were things that required too much background explanation.
Yeah.
And actually, I tell you, the thing that's really hard is, particularly with potentially humorous ideas, that if you tried to explain it, it would kill the joke anyway. And that's what I thought, well, that's probably... You also have to think, and this is a book that is aimed at the mass market. So I thought, no, to be honest, this is too much something that you'd say to your friends. And I very much wanted it to be a book that wasn't just for my friends. I wanted as many people as possible to get something out of it. So I tried to balance famous names, less famous names. There's a big playlist that is nearly finished, which is going to be circulated with the book. And I tried to go with tracks that weren't usually the usual oldie staples. So yeah, I mean, the reason this book came about in the first place is that after writing Don't Stop the Music, mysteries lingered about the 80s where I still just thought, God, I don't know. Still don't know the answer to that. I wonder what the answer is. And so that made me keen to try and see if I could go a bit further with doing a methodical research project of the 80s, rather like you've done yourself by listening to it. So yeah.
And within that, I mean, there's obviously obvious voices or characters that recur, whether it be Freddie Mercury with Queen or his solo work or or Trevor Horn. Trevor Horn is obviously scattered all the way through the decade in some respects.
Yes, he is. Yeah,
But were there any particular voices that you almost wanted to bring to the surface and shed some light on during the writing of this book?
Yes, but I think it's interesting because I mean there are people like, a good example of someone like that is someone like Naina Cherry, who of course has published her own book in the period since in between me starting this and it coming out. She's done her own autobiography, but I mean she has an interesting 80s in that she's with Rip Rig and Panic, who are probably best known for being in The Young Ones, an episode of The Young Ones.
Mm-hmm.
But they're a very interesting group. Come out of that sort of period of funk and almost free jazz. And so she's on songs like Bob Hope Takes Risks and You're My Kind of Climate and things like that. And then she's singing with The. And then she's making the first version of what becomes Buffalo Stance with Stock Aitken and Waterman, and then Buffalo Stance becomes a massive hit single at the end of the decade. I mean, there are names like that you sort of find they're often the ones who are not successful immediately, who are often the people who have this sort of kind of come in and out of the story. Something like Stevie Wonder's always interesting because I don't think anyone would claim, I don't think even he would claim, that his best works from the 80s. But it's interesting how he influences other people. So for instance, obviously he's largely at the forefront of having a national holiday in America, Martin Luther King.
That's right, Happy Birthday.
Which starts with Happy Birthday, yeah. But at that gig, when he played Wembley Arena and it's a new song, Kate Bush is in the audience and is inspired to go and buy a Fairlight because he's got one. And works on Sat in Your Lap because she's watched Stevie Wonder working with this technology. But also Stevie Wonder's behind Gary Bird's The Crown single, so he's in this kind of, I mean, even just at the Nelson Mandela concert in '88, where he's had some of his equipment stolen, so he can't appear on stage at that moment. And so Tracy Chapman comes on to do Fast Car, who's completely unknown at this point.
Yes.
Chapman, pretty much unknown, certainly in this country. And so you get these figures who are just there when sort of Zelig-like. They have all these sort of things happening around them. And that, I think, is just really, really interesting about how these people sort of form the story. I find those kind of incidents really interesting. I mean, another one is Neil Tennant going to see the Police, knowing full well that he's going to go and have a meeting with a producer in New York because he's got this band, or he's got this duo project that he wants to try and get recorded.
Yeah. And
so the Pet Shop Boys come into being in America at this point and lays the ground for him. I mean that's a point about that. Is Pet Shop Boys were really, really big in America when they started. West End Girls were number one in America. And I think what's interesting about that is that I don't think I would have known at the time that because Neil was working in America on the American version of Smash Hits, where he interviewed Madonna and various other people, but he had that background in going to America regularly.
Yeah.
He knew what the American media was like, what the American music industry was like. And I suspect that background would have been invaluable when you're trying to start a career as a musician and a pop star. So you know that video is important, and obviously they didn't tour at the beginning. So you've got those sorts of figures. I really am rambling now, but it's like I think there's examples
Yeah.
of that all the way through the book. I hope where all these different figures get these little stories, and it builds up this world.
But this is the thing that I find with the 80s. It is so easy to ramble about it because there is just so many little snippets like that is just so enjoyable to find out. That's the joy of, I think, my podcast as well. Any personal favourite entries that you have that really tickle you in a certain way?
I tried not to think too hard about this. I think because it's really hard to isolate in individual things. I think a lot of the favourite things I discovered had an international dimension. I mean, I found it absolutely fascinating uncovering how the Soviet Union dealt with pop music. I mean, pre-Gorbachev especially. I mean, ABBA's film being banned from cinemas because they'd been in a TV special about Poland, although their contribution wasn't even used in the end. The first Beatles albums being released in Russia, which was 1986.
Are you going to mention Winds of Change being a CIA song at all?
Oh yes, well that's yes. I mean that's when did they do that? 91, wasn't it? So they would have. Yeah, that would. But I mean, but then and also just things like, I mean, I love the fact that Depeche Mode, who were not known for doing cover versions, used to encore with Joey and the Pacemakers' hit "I Like It," which is not like, that's such a weird fact, or that. Run DMC supporting Wham on some of the US tour. It just seems a really unlikely combination. But clearly, George and Andrew would have, who really, really knew their pop music. So I'm sure that they would have, wanted to get them. And then there's sort of, another one is the number of people who are inspired by this record, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, that David Byrne and Brian Eno made. Which became a favourite of all sorts of people. I mean, Kate Bush, Hank Shockley, who went on to produce Public Enemy, was a fan of that record. Herbie Hancock was a fan of that record. And that record, for those people who don't know it, is kind of global journey with lots of vocal samples. And it had no hits on it, but it took on a life of its own. Had this huge influence on what would happen next in pop. I mean, Herbie Hancock, again, hearing Buffalo Gals by Malcolm McLaren and being fascinated by that, or playing on Simple Minds albums, and then Ibiza playing the beginnings of house music, but also championing like Chris Rea singles and not connections you would have made necessarily. No. And this cross-pollination of styles leads into some very interesting areas, I think. I loved things like that, really, where there were all sorts of things going on there.
Do you think, having completed this, in doing so, it's changed your relationship with the decade at all?
Question. I mean, I think I liked the challenge, and I did, I wanted to find out things I didn't know. In a weird way, it sort of has made me a bit more objective about the 80s, I think. I do feel that when I was researching this book, I was listening to a lot of 80s music I haven't heard before, as well as a lot that I was revisiting. I think probably there's going to come a point after the promotion of this has died down a little bit, that I probably will not. Then I will probably move on and listen to some other era and probably go back to listening to new music again. Yes, but when I was doing this, I really was immersed in it. So it did rather sort of, I think I wanted to have, there was the understanding of when I was that age in the first place of revisiting it, but it was also to try and connect it up. And I feel now that I've probably set out what I meant to do. So it's in that sense, I feel like there's an air of completion about it, hopefully. So yes, it's been a challenge, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely.
In doing that, yeah.
we've already strayed a little bit onto the topic of what 80s music means when we were initially talking. But I mean, I mentioned that I was at Rewind South a couple of weeks ago, and
Yes.
fantastic festival. You couldn't have asked for better weather. Got very burnt on one side from the sun.
Oh, right.
But really fantastic day. Tapao, the Selector, who I'd never seen, and I've always wanted to see. Right. Pauline Black in full flow, and she was fantastic. And Midyear was there, but we were hit afterwards with the news that obviously Midyear's cancelled his autumn tour.
Oh God, of course,
because of some medical condition. I don't know if we know what it is.
Yeah,
but you start to worry, and it strikes me that in some respects these acts are more precious than they ever have been, because age is undefeated, if you know what I mean.
Well, quite, yeah.
And with that in mind, in the context of the decade in your book, what do you think the legacy is for 80s music?
I mean, I think it's funny, everyone thought the 60s would last forever in terms of how it's perceived, and actually I know that stations like Boom Radio are still playing the 60s, and in that sense you're getting it. But actually the 60s is kind of marginalized now. People don't really talk about it that much anymore. So whether that will happen to the 80s, I don't know. The thing I found really interesting when I was going through the research, there was always this friction of, is music supposed to be entertainment, or is it about the message? And that seems particularly, I mean, you get that in all eras, I think.
Yeah.
But it's particularly acute in the 80s. And it is interesting how the two bands that I consider the first big bands of the 80s who have no real connection with the 70s, and they're Spandau Ballet and the second version of Adam and the Ants.
Yep. Totally
Both
agree.
of them talked at the time specifically about bringing back entertainment and showbiz. Adam Ant said that he wanted himself and Marco Peroni to be the Rodgers and Hammerstein of the 80s. And they did do things like the Royal Variety performance, which you can't really imagine most of the punk rock groups doing that. But they did that. They wanted to be part of the showbiz fraternity. And, they both wanted that, as opposed to a lot of the post-punk era, which I think is fantastic music, but it is a very gloomy period for pop music. You listen to 1980, you're in the shadow of the apocalypse all the way through, apart from disco. Nearly all of it is about the end of the world. It just seems like that happens again in sort of 84. But I think maybe that's the legacy of the 80s, that pop in all its different forms could talk about almost anything. So whether that was unemployment or anti-apartheid or AIDS, homophobia, possible nuclear destruction, and often in a very accessible and tuneful and colourful way. But you could still also have songs about love and dancing and sex and partying. And I think, pop music can be about anything, and it still can. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I always find it fascinating, especially in that early period where you've got the birth of UB40 from Birmingham and you've got the birth of Duran Duran from Birmingham, where
that's right.
UB40 are singing about being working class lads and their challenges, and then you've got Duran Duran striking a very different tone, and it just shows how music can move you in different ways. I think it's
Yes. I mean, I think it's interesting how those two bands you've just mentioned unusually are still there at the end of the decade in a way that it's a harsh decade for bands to survive for the whole 10 years. It's not, you don't get many of them doing it, and it's interesting how they both manage. I mean, admittedly, Duran Duran were a trio by the end of it rather than a quintet, but actually those they are unusually hardy in being able to get through that period, because it was a bumpy old ride for a lot of people, really, in terms of keeping it going, especially after the Band-Aid period. I think after that it's quite hard for some of those acts to keep going, I think.
Very much so. You mentioned the ultimate playlist you're putting together, and there is a quiz. I have to admit, I haven't done the quiz yet. I'll have to give it a go at some point. I mean, I think this is almost an impossible task, but what would be your top 5 80s tunes?
Glad you emailed me about this in advance. I would find this hard off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I've tried to choose 5 singles that changed my perspective or opened a door for me in terms of exploring other things. And also significantly, I think all 5 of these would be singles that I loved when they came out. So I'm not trying to be retrospective about this. These were all singles I loved at the time.
Mm.
So first one would be Adam and the Ants and music.
I love that music.
It's just a brilliant record. I mean, I think it properly ushers in the 80s. I think a lot of 1980, you could almost say, was called 1970-10 because it was 1979 again, really. And the 1979 is one of the best years for pop music. But this record seemed to say, okay, this is now. And I bought this January 81, I think, which was about 3 months after I started buying singles.
Yeah. But
also, it was just after Lennon was assassinated. There seemed to be saying, okay, this awful thing's happened, but pop is in rude health. There's no point looking back for too long. And of course, one of the things that's famous about Lennon in the last year of his life is that one of the things that drove him back to the studio was people like Madness and the B-52s and new music was why he wanted to get back in the studio. So it's interesting about that. You know, what he would have done next is a fascinating question. You know, the second choice I think would be OC from by Laurie Anderson, which I mentioned earlier, because I realized you could make experimental music. You could make an 8-minute single and it would still be a bestseller. I find that I was, as I say, about 11 when that came out. I think I bought it partly because it's an 8-minute single. I still love that record. It was voted the worst single of the year by Smash Hits readers. They were wrong. Honestly, I firmly believe that's terrible. Yeah. Terrible mistake. Anyway, my number 3 is Dr. Mabusa by Propaganda, which is European, expansive and epic and mysterious, and I guess that's a glorious thing. My number 4 would be Kiss by Princeton Revolution, which, apart from it being a killer dance record, I love the way it understands how the spaces in records are as important as what you fill it with. So the silences are important as well. I liked Prince before that single, but that was the one that made me start to explore the back catalogue really and try and find all the old records. And, I really got into him after that. And not to mention getting into things like Sly and the Family Stone, which once I heard Sly and the Family Stone, I went, oh, yes, okay. So there's a lot of straight lines here. I can see exactly how some of this had influenced him. And my 5th record is Della Soul's Me, Myself and I. And
brilliant song.
I'd loved some hip hop for that, but that album, 3 Feet High and Rising, was such an adventure. It was funny, and some of it was quite serious and political, but actually, it had a very light touch to it, and it used samples so inventively and wittily. I just thought they were total geniuses. So those would be my 5 records, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm brilliant choices, and certainly completely with you with Me, Myself and I as well. I think from listening to that then got me into eventually bands like, or groups like Tribe Called Quest and Far Side.
Oh, yeah.
All of that kind of 90s hip hop as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Into the Groove drops on the 2nd of October, as I understand it. What are you hoping most readers, both, 80s diehards, but also new listeners, will take away from your exploration of the decade?
Hopefully, that they might learn some new things. That's partly because I learned some new things. But also, I think the story of the 80s, it's stories of the 80s, really. It's plural. It's strands of stories. And also just that there's more to the 80s than some nostalgia machines would have you believe. I think it's as simple as that, really. I think it's those two things.
And for long-time fans or curious newcomers alike, why is Into the Groove the book you can't afford to miss if you care about music history? Obviously, Christmas is coming up; could be a good present. So,
it's throwing down a gauntlet, though, isn't it? I think it's I would say though it's not always about the obvious events or the biggest names. Sometimes the seismic changes come from relatively small beginnings. And most of the history books that I find fascinating in all sorts of areas are clear in doing that. They often find, how far back can you go? Where does the first does that first sort of discovery happen? So hopefully, I've tried and succeeded in emphasising the small but significant in the pages of the book. Hopefully.
Excellent. Well, Justin, you've been very generous with your time today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for asking me, Chris. Thank you.
Cheers. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.